The Law of One, Session 18, February 4, 1981.
Ra, I am Ra. I greet you in the love and the light of the infinite Creator. We communicate now.
Questioner, I was thinking last night that if I were in the place of Rahat this time, the first distortion of the law of one might cause me to mix some erroneous data with the true information that I was transmitting to this group. Do you do this?
Ra, I am Ra. We do not intentionally do this. However, there will be confusion. The errors which have occurred due to the occasional variation in the vibrational complex of this instrument due to its ingestion of a chemical substance. It is not our intent in this particular project to create erroneous information but to express in the confining ambience of your language system the feeling of the infinite mystery of the one creation in its infinite and intelligent unity.
Questioner, can you tell me what the chemical substance is that was ingested? Causes poor contact?
Ra, I am Ra. This is not a clear query. Could you please restate?
Questioner, you just stated that you had some problems with the instrument because of the ingestion by the instrument of some chemical substance. Can you tell me what the substance was?
Ra, I am Ra. The substance of which we speak is called vibratory sound complex, LSD. It does not give poor contact if it is used in conjunction with the contact. The difficulty of this particular substance is that there is, shall we say, a very dramatic drop-off of the effect of this substance. In each case this instrument began the session with the distortion towards extreme vital energy which this substance produces. However, this entity was, during the session, at the point where this substance no longer was in sufficient strength to amplify the entity's abilities to express vital energy. Thus, first the phenomenon of, shall we say, a spotty contact, and then, as the instrument relies again upon its own vibrational complexes of vital energy, the vital energy being in this case very low, it became necessary to abruptly cut off communication in order to preserve and nurture the instrument. This particular chemical substance is both helpful and unhelpful in these contacts for the causes given.
Questioner, are there any foods that are helpful or harmful that the instrument might eat?
Ra, I am Ra. This instrument has body complex distortion towards ill health in the distortion direction corrected best by ingestion of the foodstuffs of your grains and your vegetables, as you call them. However, this is extremely unimportant when regarded as an aid with equality to other aids such as attitude which this instrument has in abundance. It, however, aids the vital energies of this instrument, with less distortion towards ill health, to ingest foodstuffs in the above manner with occasional ingestion of what you call your meats, due to the instrument's need to lessen the distortion towards low vital energy.
Questioner, thank you. I have a question here from Jim that I will read verbatim. Much of the mystic tradition of seeking on earth holds that belief that the individual self must be erased or obliterated and the material world ignored for an entity to reach nirvana, as it's called, or enlightenment. What is the proper role of the individual self and its worldly activities in aiding an entity to grow more into the law of one?
Ra, I am Ra. The proper role of the entity is in this density to experience all things desired, to then analyze, understand, and accept these experiences, distilling from them the love/light within them. Nothing shall be overcome. That which is not needed falls away. The orientation develops due to analysis of desire. These desires become more and more distorted towards conscious application of love/light as the entity furnishes itself with distilled experience. We have found it to be inappropriate in the extreme to encourage the overcoming of any desires, except to suggest the imagination rather than the carrying out in the physical plane, as you call it, of those desires not consonant with the law of one, this preserving the primal distortion of free will. The reason it is unwise to overcome is that overcoming is an unbalanced action creating difficulties in balancing in the time/space continuum. Overcoming thus creates the further environment for holding on to that which apparently has been overcome. All things are acceptable in the proper time for each entity, and in experiencing, in understanding, in accepting, in then sharing with other selves, the appropriate description shall be moving away from distortions of one kind to distortions of another which may be more consonant with the law of one. It is, shall we say, a shortcut to simply ignore or overcome any desire. It must instead be understood and accepted. This takes patience and experience which can be analyzed with care, with compassion for self and for other self.
Questioner: basically I would say that to infringe on the free will of another self or another entity would be the basic thing never to do under the law of one. Can you state any other breaking of the law of one than this basic rule?
Ra, I am Ra. As one proceeds from the primal distortion of free will, one proceeds to the understanding of the focal points of intelligent energy which have created the intelligences or the ways of a particular mind/body/spirit complex in its environment, both what you would call natural and what you would call man-made. Thus, the distortions to be avoided are those which do not take into consideration the distortions of the focus of energy of love/light, or shall we say, the logos of this particular sphere or density. These include the lack of understanding of the needs of the natural environment, the needs of other selves mind/body/spirit complexes. These are many due to the various distortions of man-made complexes in which the intelligence and awareness of entities themselves have chosen a way of using the energies available. Thus, what would be an improper distortion with one entity is proper with another. We can suggest an attempt to become aware of the other self as self and thus do that action which is needed by other self, understanding from the other self's intelligence and awareness. In many cases this does not involve the breaking of the distortion of free will into a distortion or fragmentation called infringement. However, it is a delicate matter to be of service, and compassion, sensitivity, and an ability to empathize are helpful in avoiding the distortions of man-made intelligence and awareness. The area or arena called the societal complex is an arena in which there are no particular needs for care, for it is the prerogative/honor/duty of those in the particular planetary sphere to act according to its free will for the attempted aid of the social complex. Thus, you have two simple directives: awareness of the intelligent energy expressed in nature, awareness of the intelligent energy expressed in self to be shared, when it seems appropriate, by the entity with the social complex, and you have one infinitely subtle and various set of distortions of which you may be aware, that is, distortions with respect to self and other selves not concerning free will but concerning harmonious relationships and service to others as other selves would most benefit.
Questioner: as an entity in this density grows from childhood, he becomes more aware of his responsibilities. Is there an age below which an entity is not responsible for his actions, or is he responsible from the time of birth?
Ra, I am Ra. An entity incarnating upon the earth plane becomes conscious of self at a varying point in its time/space progress through the continuum. This may have a median, shall we say, of approximately 15 of your months. Some entities become conscious of self at a period closer to incarnation, some at a period farther from this event. In all cases responsibility then becomes retroactive from that point backwards in the continuum, so that distortions are to be understood by the entity and dissolved as the entity learns.
Questioner: then an entity, say, 4 years old would be totally responsible for any actions that were against or inharmonious with the law of one. Is this correct?
Ra, I am Ra. This is correct. It may be noted that it has been arranged by your social complex structures that the newer entities to incarnation are to be provided with guides of a physical mind/body/spirit complex, thus being able to learn quickly what is consonant with the law of one.
Questioner: Who are these guides?
Ra, I am Ra. These guides are what you call parents, teachers, and friends.
Questioner, I see. The entity Aleister Crowley wrote "Do what thou wilt" is the whole of the law. He was obviously in understanding, to some extent, of the law of one. Where is this entity now?
Ra, I am Ra. This entity is within your inner planes. This entity is in a healing process.
Questioner, did this entity, then, even though he intellectually understood the law of one, misuse it and therefore have to go through this healing process?
Ra, I am Ra. This entity became, may we use the vibration sound complex, overstimulated with the true nature of things. This overstimulation resulted in behavior that was beyond the conscious control of the entity. The entity thus, in many attempts to go through the process of balancing, as we have described the various energy centers beginning with the red ray and moving upwards, became somewhat overly impressed or caught up in this process and became alienated from other selves. This entity was positive. However, its journey was difficult due to the inability to use, synthesize, and harmonize the understandings of the desires of self so that it might have shared, in full compassion, with other selves. This entity thus became very unhealthy, as you may call it, in a spiritual complex manner, and it is necessary for those with this type of distortion towards inner pain to be nurtured in the inner planes until such an entity is capable of viewing the experiences again with the lack of distortion towards pain.
Questioner, you stated yesterday that forgiveness is the eradicator of karma. I am assuming that balanced forgiveness for the full eradication of karma would require forgiveness not only of other selves but forgiveness of self. Am I correct?
Ra, I am Ra. You are correct. We will briefly expand upon this understanding in order to clarify. Forgiveness of other self is forgiveness of self. An understanding of this insists upon full forgiveness upon the conscious level of self and other self, for they are one. A full forgiveness is thus impossible without the inclusion of self.
Questioner, thank you. A most important point to my way of thinking. You mentioned that there were a number of confederations. Do all serve the infinite creator in basically the same way, or do some specialize in some particular types of service?
Ra, I am Ra. All serve the one creator. There is nothing else to serve, for the creator is all that there is. It is impossible not to serve the creator. There are simply various distortions of this service. As in the confederation which works with your peoples, each confederation is a group of specialized individual social memory complexes, each doing that which it expresses to bring into manifestation.
Questioner, can you tell me how Yahweh communicated to Earth's people?
Ra, I am Ra. This is a somewhat complex question. The first communication was what you would call genetic. The second communication was the walking among your peoples to produce further genetic changes in consciousness. The third was a series of dialogues with chosen channels.
Questioner, can you tell me what these genetic changes were and how they were brought about?
Ra, I am Ra. Some of these genetic changes were in a form similar to what you call the cloning process. Thus, entities incarnated in the image of the Yahweh entities. The second was a contact of the nature you know as sexual, changing the mind/body/spirit complex through the natural means of the patterns of reproduction devised by the intelligent energy of your physical complex.
Questioner, can you tell me specifically what they did in this case?
Ra, I am Ra. We have answered this question. Please restate for further information.
Questioner, can you tell me the difference between the sexual programming, let us say, prior to Yahweh's intervention and after intervention?
Ra, I am Ra. This is a question which we can only answer by stating that intervention by genetic means is the same no matter what the source of this change.
Questioner, can you tell me Yahweh's purpose in making the genetic sexual changes?
Ra, I am Ra. The purpose 75,000 years ago, as you measure time, the changes subsequent to that time were of one purpose only, that to express in the mind/body complex those characteristics which would lead to further and more speedy development of the spiritual complex.
Questioner, how did these characteristics go about leading to the more spiritual development?
Ra, I am Ra. The characteristics which were encouraged included sensitivity of all the physical senses to sharpen the experiences, and the strengthening of the mind complex in order to promote the ability to analyze these experiences.
Questioner, when did Yahweh act to perform the genetic changes that Yahweh performed?
Ra, I am Ra. The Yahweh group worked with those of the planet you call Mars 75,000 years ago in what you would call the cloning process. There are differences, but they lie in the future of your time/space continuum, and we cannot break the free will law of confusion. The 2600 approximately, time was the second time we correct ourselves. 3600 approximately, the time of attempts by those of the Orion group during this cultural complex. This was a series of encounters in which the ones called Anak were impregnated with the new genetic coding by your physical complex means so that the organisms would be larger and stronger.
Questioner, why did they want larger and stronger organisms?
Ra, the ones of Yahweh were attempting to create an understanding of the law of one by creating mind/body complexes capable of grasping the law of one. The experiment was a decided failure from the view of the desired distortions due to the fact that rather than assimilating the law of one, it was a great temptation to consider the so-called social complex or subcomplex as elite or different and better than other selves, this one of the techniques of service to self.
Questioner, then the Orion group. I'm not quite sure that I understand this. Do you mean that the Orion group produced this larger body complex to create an elite so that the law of one could be applied in what we call the negative sense?
Ra, I am Ra. This is incorrect. The entities of Yahweh were responsible for this procedure in isolated cases as experiments in combating the Orion group. However, the Orion group were able to use this distortion of mind/body complex to inculcate the thoughts of the elite rather than concentrations upon the learning/teaching of oneness.
Questioner, well, was Yahweh then of the Confederation?
Ra, I am Ra. Yahweh was of the Confederation but was mistaken in its attempts to aid.
Questioner, then Yahweh's communications did not help or did not create what Yahweh wished for them to create. Is this correct?
Ra, I am Ra. The results of this interaction were quite mixed. Where the entities were of a vibrational sum characteristic which embraced oneness, the manipulations of Yahweh were very useful. Wherein the entities of free will had chosen a less positively oriented configuration of some total vibratory complex, those of the Orion group were able for the first time to make serious inroads upon the consciousness of the planetary complex.
Questioner, can you tell me specifically what allowed the most serious of these inroads to be made by the Orion group?
Ra, I am Ra. This will be the final full question. Specifically those who are strong, intelligent, etc., have a temptation to feel different from those who are less intelligent and less strong. This is a distorted perception of oneness with other selves. It allowed the Orion group to form the concept of the Holy War, as you may call it. This is a seriously distorted perception. There were many of these wars of a destructive nature.
Questioner, thank you very much. I believe that to be a very important point in understanding the total workings of the Law of One. It'll be helpful. As you probably know, I must work for the next 3 days, so we will possibly have another session tonight if you think it is possible. And the next session after that would not be until 4 days from now. Do you believe another session tonight is possible?
Ra, I am Ra. This instrument is somewhat weak. This is a distortion caused by lack of vital energy. Thus, nurturing the instrument in physical balancing will allow another session. Do you understand?
Questioner, not completely. What specifically shall we do for physical balancing?
Ra, I am Ra. 1. Take care with the foodstuffs. 2. Manipulate the physical complex to alleviate the distortion towards physical complex pain. 3. Encourage a certain amount of what you would call your exercise. The final injunction, to take special care with the alignments this second session so that the entity may gain as much aid as possible from the various symbols. We suggest you check these symbols most carefully. This entity is slightly misplaced from the proper configuration. Not important at this time. More important when a second session is to be scheduled. I am Ra. I leave you in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one Creator. Adonai.